Good evening and welcome. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Catherine Schofield to the South Asian Symphony Foundation's Symphony Lecture here at the Bangalore International Center. Professor Schofield's own musical journey began not in the archives, but with a violin in her hands. Growing up in Australia, she trained as a classical violinist while being immersed in folk traditions, playing and singing in family ensembles from a very young age. What began as a practical family story slowly opened into a wider musical curiosity. While studying at Conservatoire, she found herself increasingly drawn to Indian classical music, especially its spirit of improvisation, virtuosity, and the idea that the performer is also, in a sense, the composer. That fascination became the foundation of a remarkable scholarly path. Today, Professor Schofield is one of the world's leading historians of South Asian music and sound cultures, and as Sandhya just mentioned, she serves as the head of the Department of Music at King's College, London. Her work explores the musical worlds of Mughal and early modern South Asia, the deep links between music and Muslim devotional traditions, and the way sound can create spaces of coexistence across difference. So she explores both the Muslim and the Hindu musical traditions of India to find that coexistence, those bridges that set aside difference. This evening also reflects the spirit of the South Asian Symphony Foundation, whose work rests on a simple but urgent belief that music can do what politics often cannot: create listening, build trust, and open spaces for the shared imagination. In a world that often feels fractured and uncertain, our work is a quiet insistence that harmony is not a metaphor, but a discipline, something we rehearse patiently across borders. We're especially grateful to the Bangalore International Center, a long-standing collaborator of the Foundation and the intellectual home for conversations such as we are conducting today. The BIC has consistently supported spaces where art, ideas, and public dialogue meet, and we are honored to continue this partnership here tonight. As mentioned, this evening, Professor Schofield will take us across oceans and centuries in her lecture, Strings Across the Ocean: Musical Connections Between India and Europe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine Schofield.
Thank you so much, and good evening to you all. Firstly, I would like to most sincerely thank the Bangalore International Center, the South Asian Symphony Foundation, and their founder, Mrs. Nirupama Rao, for your very kind invitation to me to deliver this symphony lecture this evening. As someone whose first professional job was as a Western classical orchestral viola player, I started out as a violinist, and who has dedicated my life and career ever since to my love of Indian music, I'm fully in sympathy with the principal aim of the South Asian Symphony Foundation, which is through music to promote greater cultural integration between different peoples and regions for the cause of peace. This evening, I'm going to focus on the very long history of connection and exchange between the Indian subcontinent and Western Europe through the circulation and adaptation to different cultures and environments of musical instruments, and in particular stringed instruments. We often think of music and musical instruments as being specific to and iconic of particular national identities. So Edward Elgar's pomp and circumstance marches with England, for instance, or the sitar with India. But as the simple example of the Carnatic violin shows, and as I'll elaborate upon this evening, it's possible, when understood in their fullest historical contexts, for music and musical instruments to be simultaneously global and local, to be symbolic not of narrow identities, but of our shared humanity and connected cultural heritages across long stretches of time and space. For to be human is to be musical, and to be musical, human. Examples of ancient musical instruments have been found in every part of the inhabited globe, dating back at least 35,000 years to Paleolithic bone flutes found in Germany, made from the hollow wing bones of birds pierced with tiny mouth and finger holes. Over the millennia, the different types of musical instruments proliferate endlessly as far as the human mind can imagine, and hands manufacture and ornament. And since the earliest written records, human civilizations have tried to differentiate and define musical instruments and their unique qualities by placing them into classes according to culturally important logics. The ancient Chinese, for example, classified their musical instruments into 8 types based on what they were made from, and therefore, to a certain extent, what they sounded like: silk, bamboo, wood, stone, metal, clay, gourds, and animal skin. The modern system of empirical organology used today, and organology is the official word for the study and classification of musical instruments, was developed in the early 20th century to classify all of the world's instruments according to the same logical principles of architectural construction. It was devised by the Austro-German musicologists Erich von Hornbostel and Kurt Sachs, and is known, amazingly enough, as the Hornbostel-Sachs or Sachs-Hornbostel system. It was partly based on the Dewey Decimal System used for library classification of books, but also based on the work done by the 19th century curator of musical instruments at the Brussels Conservatoire, Victor Charles Mahillon. The Brussels Conservatoire collected examples of musical instruments from all over the globe, which are now housed, as we see here, in the Musical Instruments Museum in Brussels. At the top level of his classification system, Mahillon divided the world of musical instruments into 4 types based on how their sound is produced: via a string, like a vina, chordophones; a column of air, like a flute, aerophones; a stretched membrane like a drum, membranophones; and the body of the instrument itself like castanets or sticks, idiophones. Hornbostel and Sachs realized that Mahillon's system could be expanded to cover any instrument from anywhere in the world, though these days we also have to contend with instruments whose sound is produced by electricity, and there are some weird exceptions like the piano, which is both a string and percussion instrument at the same time. What fewer people realize is that Mahillon got his 4-fold classification of musical instruments based on sound production mechanism from the oldest Sanskrit treatise on music in the world, the Natya Shastra, which dates back to the early centuries of the Common Era. And he got that via the work of prolific and in some ways rather odd 19th century Bengali musicologist and instrument inventor Surendra Mohan Tagore of the Paturiagat Tagores. As part of his project of national and self-reinvention, as both steeped in Indian tradition and scientifically modern, S.M. Tagore translated into English, as well as into Hindi and Bengali, vast swathes of Sanskrit writings on music, including on instruments. Contemporary ethnomusicologist Yup Bohr suggests Mahillon must have arrived at his classification of musical instruments from reading S.M. Tagore's Yantrakosha, a treasury of the musical instruments of ancient and modern India from 1880, which reproduces the Natya Shastra's classification system. What's more, though, Tagore also had a veritable factory of artisans churning out real-life models of what he imagined these ancient Indian instruments to look like. And he then sent full sets of these instruments around the world to major museums where you can still see them in British India, so the Indian Museum in Calcutta, the UK, the Royal College of Music, the Victoria and Albert Museum, Oxford University, North America, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Australia, Melbourne, and Europe, including Paris, Berlin, Rome, and, of course, the Brussels Conservatoire in 1876. And this instrument here, is the Narsinga that Tagore had made and sent to the Brussels Conservatoire and to Mahion. Indeed, Eupbourne notes that Mahion's descriptions of Indian musical instruments were largely based on the instruments that Tagore sent. So it was in this way that S.M. Tagore's work in both theory and instrument manufacture introduced to Mahion the fourfold categories of the Natya Shastra. And I'm just going to quote Jonathan Katz and Richard Widdis's recent translation of this section of the Natya Shastra, which is chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. So musical instruments, one should know that they are of four kinds: strung, tata, chordophones; covered, avanadha, membranophones; solid, ghana, idiophones; and hollow, shushira, aerophones. They are defined as follows. It is the stringed instrument that is known as strung, the drum as covered, the cymbals should be understood as solid, and it is the flute that is called hollow. It's important to note in passing that Bohr says that although Tagore, and I'm quoting, passionately believed that most Indian instruments had an ancient origin, he frequently Sanskritized their names and also presented a number of highly questionable reconstructions of ancient instruments, as well as hybrid forms, which were possibly his own inventions. So certainly a lot of the instruments that Tagore sent to overseas museums had and have never been played, and some are in fact unplayable and don't exist outside Tagore's collections. But thus did S.M. Tagore use globalization in the era of colonialism as a means to stealthily insert ancient Indian theoretical concepts, via some reinvention of tradition, right into the heart of the quote-unquote mainstream metropolitan juggernaut of modern European musicology. But the era of globalization, marked by the height of modern European empires in the late 19th and early 20th century, is thousands of years late in the history of musical instrument circulation between the Indian subcontinent and Europe. So this evening, I'm going to go back to two much earlier moments of circulation and adaptation, focusing just on stringed instruments or chordophones. Both examples are, in fact, organologically speaking, lutes. So a lute is a stringed instrument with a carved and covered resonating chamber and a neck with a fingerboard that may be plucked or played with a bow. And we're going to look at a plucked example and a bowed example. So my first example is the Gandharan short-necked plucked lute, which travelled from east to west along the Silk Road from ancient Gandhara, in what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, to the Middle East and Europe. And my second example is the bowed lute known as the violin, which travelled out of Italy in the other direction to India via the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the 16th century, and is now both inherently European and Indian. It's worth noting in passing that globalization does not merely consist in the passing of an instrument along inter-regional routes, but in the very physical materials of which instruments are made. And this is also a deeply personal story for me, because my own musicianship is a product of such globalization. And this is my favorite family photograph. Here am I, aged 7, and I'm just beginning to learn to play the violin. And that's my dad accompanying me on the banjo, the American folk instrument. My mother and my younger sisters are there on the right. My sister seems to be singing. I'm not going to talk about the banjo tonight, which is fascinating. Its origins lie even further back in the long-necked lutes of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, at least 5,000 years ago. But the banjo, of course, made its way from West Africa in the memories of enslaved Black people across the Atlantic Ocean where they remade it in North America using whatever technologies they had to hand, thus creating a highly distinctive sound. And the banjo, of course, also made its way to India in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the banjo in this photograph gives away that we're probably playing American folk music here, or perhaps Irish or Scottish jigs and reels. My parents were part of the folk revival of the late 60s and 70s. But we're in Australia. I was born in Australia. I learned the violin and went to conservatoire there to do my undergraduate degree. I ended up playing the viola in a professional orchestra in Queensland. And I gave that career because I fell in love. Firstly, with an Englishman, and I moved to the UK, where I've been ever since. And then, or rather simultaneously, and more importantly, in fact, with Hindustani classical music and Indian history, who can explain the movements of the heart. The heart wants what the heart wants. And if that renders national boundaries completely nonsensical, then that's what music is for. It's to remove the boundaries and obstacles between us all. But globalization lies in the body of my violin too, because the evolution of the modern violin would never have happened if Christopher Columbus had not accidentally bumped into the Americas while trying to find India and Indonesia. Several parts of the violin and bow are dependent on natural materials that do not come from Europe, but from all over the world. Ebony wood for pegs, fingerboards, chin rests and tailpieces come from southern India and Sri Lanka, West Africa, or Indonesia. The ivory in the bow, of course, comes, or these days now past tense, came from Indian and African elephants, and mother of pearl from under the sea. But the biggest innovation in violin playing, the innovation that made violins, violas, cellos, and double basses loud and led to the creation of the symphony orchestra, was the invention of the taut bow in the late 18th century. There would be no symphony orchestra without the taut bow. The revolutionary bowmaker, Francois Xavier Taut, was able to strengthen the bow while keeping its subtleness and suppleness because he used Pernambuco wood from Brazil. And this is still the most customary wood used in bowmaking today. So the story of musical instruments themselves and the materials they're made of is as global as instruments that travel. But we're going to turn now to my first example of ancient circulation of instruments between the Indian subcontinent and Western Eurasia, the Gandharan short-necked lute. And you can see a final example here from a Gandharan wall carving of a woman playing what is organologically a lute. It's a stringed instrument with a deep, round, hollow, resonating chamber connected to its neck and fingerboard. Unlike the long-necked lutes of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the neck is short and connects seamlessly to the lute's small, pear-shaped body. And the woman performing also appears to be using a plectrum held in her right hand to strum the strings. I love maps, and this is one of my favorite maps of all time. It shows the main trade routes of Africa and Eurasia around about 1000 CE. So we're talking about 1000 years into the future from Gandhara. And for context, 1000 is approximately when the Saxons are about to lose England to the Normans. The Rajputs are still in charge of Delhi. And Mahmud of Ghazni is just about moving into the Punjab. The thing I especially love about this map is all those trade routes far into Africa. It's worth noting that the trans-Saharan trade routes of the time provided Europe with more gold than later Spanish mines in the Americas did. But also look at all those lines stretching from Japan all the way over there in the east to Turkey in the middle of the west, including down into India, a long way down into India, all the way down. And this is what we today call the Silk Roads. But also look at the red lines across the Indian Ocean, connecting Arabia with the west coast of India, and India to the Straits of Malacca. It took 2 monsoons to get across, all the way across, and to the South China Sea. So 1000 years ago, look how connected the world was. We're going back several centuries, though, to the Kushan Empire and to Gandhara, which lay across the major Eurasian crossroads, connecting India to Europe and to the rest of Asia. As everyone knows, the Greek emperor Alexander the Great invaded the Indian subcontinent in 328 of the BCE, before the Common Era. He left Greek forces behind near the Ganges River, but especially in the area that later became known as Gandhara, in what's now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. In 180 BCE, the Greco-Bactrian Buddhist king Demetrius, and Bactria is what is now Balkh in Afghanistan, invaded the Ganges area and started the first of a series of Indo-Greek dynasties that lasted 200 years and whose artistic heritage lasted even longer under the Kushan dynasty that replaced those dynasties. The Kushan Empire was a syncretic Greek Buddhist empire that lasted from the 1st to the 4th centuries of the Common Era, as far south and east as Varanasi, with many archaeological artifacts found in Mathura, but it was centered on Gandhara. And it was via Gandhara that Buddhism spread from India eastwards to China and then to Japan and Korea. Probably the most iconic Gandharan Buddhist monument were, sadly, the Bamiyan Buddhas, but the whole area is covered with Buddhist and Tantric and courtly archaeological remains from the Kushan Empire. And it was in Gandhara, under the Kushans, that the short-necked lute with a pear or almond-shaped body seems to have been invented around about the 1st century of the Common Era. And you can see two different examples of it here, both being played by women. According to organologist Gabriella Curry, this is the most common type of lute in all of Gandharan art, a pear-shaped lute carved from a single piece of wood, with the neck shorter than the body, with 2 to 4 strings, usually 4. No detectable frets to guide the placement of fingers, and most often a slightly bent neck, which will become important later. The context is frequently one of Buddhist ritual. So here we have a cohort of musicians performing for some kind of Buddhist ritual. Curry furthermore argues these lutes are, quote, the only musical instrument that seems genuinely to characterize Gandhara as a defined cultural entity. The short-necked lute is intrinsically linked to Bactrian and Gandharan culture and rises at the same time that the Kushan Empire rose to power. So, from Gandhara, the short and bent-necked lute moved gradually east with trade and Buddhist religion along the Silk Roads to China and Japan, where it became the pipa and the biwa, and later on westwards, adopted by Muslim dynasties, to the Middle East and thence to Europe, where it became the barabat, and the barabat developed into the medieval oud, alud, the lute. So lute comes from alud, the Arabic word for the same instrument. This rather wonderful object is one of my favourite things. It's now in the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and it's a handbag. It was made in Mosul in Iraq in about 1300. And at this time, it was a capital of the Mongol Ilkhanid Sultanate. So the Mongols, of course, under Genghis Khan, invaded this part of the world all the way into Europe. But by this point, the Mongols had embraced Islam. And this handbag would have been worn by a Mongol lady, and it's covered with pictures of musicians, dancers, and partygoers at festive events. And on the bar at the top is this tiny little picture of an oud and an oud player, which is almost indistinguishable from its Gandharan forebears in the short-necked, pear-bodied lute. But long before the Mongols conquered the Middle East, in the 13th century, the oud had become settled throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and the Islamic parts of the northern Mediterranean, Spain, Sicily, as the classical instrument of Arabic music. So we're talking about around about 1000 again. So we now pass to one of the most significant moments of musical encounter in the medieval period, a rather violent one. This is how the oud became the lute of the chevalier, the knight, and their ladies. And we're talking about the Crusades, in which successive waves of Europeans from Christendom invaded the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean lands, often living there for long periods of time, waging war against the Muslim and Christian rulers of the region. We should not forget that Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople and now Istanbul, was the seat of the Roman Emperor until 1453, which was just 20 years before Michelangelo was born. Istanbul, or Constantinople, was a major western hub of both the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trades, and the Levant, which is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, was historically an extremely rich melting pot of cultures. And it was here that oud was picked up by Europeans and became the lute. The oud and the lute are still major instruments today. We have the oud at the top and the lute at the bottom there, the modern performers. Although you can see some differences in their modern construction, it's still absolutely obvious that they are, to all intents and purposes, the same instrument, one that started its journey in far distant Gandhara 2,000 years ago. Also on this slide, as a mean of segueing into our next example, is a Renaissance painting that I like to call Creepy Baby. But I mean, look at it. But which brings together ancient Greece and the short-necked lute in the mythical Greek figure of Arion, the first musician ever mentioned in a European history book. And the book was written by the father of history, Herodotus. And you'll note that Arion here is playing a short-necked lute, but under his chin, and he's playing it with a bow. This is likely to be a rendition of a rebec, another instrument that came from Central Asia along the Silk Road, but which morphed in the early 16th century in Italy into the violin, which you all know today. So from Italy, the violin made its way back to South Asia with Portuguese ships, plying the new trade route round the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and across the Indian Ocean to the west coast of India. And they say that Vasco da Gama was guided into Calicut port in 1498 by a navigator local to the region, probably a Gujarati, possibly somebody from Arabia. So we're moving forward now into the early modern period, 1498 onwards, and to that particular variant of the bowed lute called the violin. But first, a quick glimpse of where bowed lutes come from, and yes, you will recognize this map. We have seen it before this evening. So the use of a bow to play lutes instead of using the fingers to pluck the strings developed about a millennium after the Gandharan plucked short-necked lute. Yes, we're back to the year 1000, but in the same general region of Central Asia. And crucial to the bow's development, of course, is the horsehair that provides the friction against the strings that makes bowed stringed instruments resonant. It's therefore most likely to have developed among the nomadic horse riding cultures of the Eurasian steppe, where the horse was first domesticated and horsehair used for all sorts of useful human technologies. The Eurasian steppe stretches from the deserts of China and Mongolia through to what is now Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, so that green circle there. The earliest known archaeological example of a bowed lute comes from China in about the 8th century, but there are many examples of bowed lutes across the ancient and medieval Silk Road that predate the violin, and these include the North African rhubarb and the Iranian kamancha, the Indian sarangi, and the Chinese erhu. But the most likely ancestor of the violin family is the Kazakh qobuz, via the Byzantine lira and the lira di braccio. So there's all these stringed instruments evolving as we move westwards. Or if you're looking at me that way, across from Central Asia through to Europe. So another bowed stringed instrument that made its way to medieval Europe was the bowed rhubarb. In Europe, as the rebec. And the reason I've gone back is because Grumpy Owl in the corner there is playing a rebec. This is a capital from a medieval manuscript. And here we have another medieval manuscript here and another little illustration of a rebec and a modern violin player, the virtuoso violinist Charlie Siem, who is also a model. He's very handsome. So there are several examples, as I've just said, that still exist in Central Asia and India, including the sarangi of the bowed stringed instrument. But the medieval European rebec is the direct descendant of the Arabic rabab and came into Europe via Spain and Sicily, which were, of course, Islamicate. The violin as we know it today and the other large members of the violin family, the viola and the cello, were first made in Brescia, in the region of Lombardy in northern Italy around about 1530. The luthiers, the instrument makers of Brescia, were known from the late 14th century onwards for making the earlier forms of bowed instruments held under the chin, as opposed to upright like the sarangi. The rebec, the vielle, and the lira di braccio. The violin very quickly caught on in Renaissance Italy, reaching the peak of perfection from the mid-16th century to the late 17th century in Cremona, where the Amati, Goneri, and Stradivari families lived and worked. From there, the violin spread all over the world, and it's now used in many different global styles of music, from classical music of all kinds, Arabic, Indian, European, to folk music, to jazz and pop. I'm going to point something out, very obvious, that's going to seem obvious once I've said it, but appears to be missed by many historians of music. The Portuguese arrived in India, bringing European with them, teaching it to Indians, more than 3 decades before the violin appeared in Brescia, in Italy. When they arrived, from 1498 onwards, a large part of the Portuguese mission concerned converting local Konkanese and Malabari residents to Catholic Christianity. Some of them, of course, were already Christians and had been since St. Thomas came to India 2,000 years ago. We know that there were Indian professional performers of European instruments in the Portuguese Indian territories as early as the early 16th century, before the invention of the violin. And as soon as the violin took off, it became the instrument of choice for amateur musicians on board East India Company ships, because it was highly portable. The other instrument, obviously, is the flute or the recorder. In other words, there have been violins in India as long as there have been violins at all. And there have almost certainly been Indian performers of the violin since the violin was invented. I personally think this makes the violin, in fact, as Indian as it is, say, English or Australian. In other words, the violin arrived in India much earlier than music historians have suggested. The late 18th century, when apparently under British colonial influence, it was taken up widely by Carnatic classical musicians, such as Muthuswami Dikshita, who incorporated the tunes of Scottish and Irish melodies into his 39 compositions known as the Nataswaram, and his younger brother, Balaswami, who died in 1858 and is supposed to be the first Carnatic musician to adapt the violin to the Indian style. And there is archaeological evidence of this. This detail of an angel playing the violin, and it's obviously a violin and not the earlier rebec, for instance, is from a 17th century decorated altar in the Church of St. Mary's Foreign in Kerala, 150 to 200 years before the great Dikshita brothers. The origin story of the Indian violin, played by Indians, is therefore much earlier than we think. This long and so far mostly unknown and undocumented history of the violin in India, and if anybody wants to come and study with me to do a project on the much longer history of the violin in India, I would love that. Played by Indian musicians, has resulted in its very wide adaptation to a range of Indian musical styles, from being the iconic instrument associated with Carnatic music today to the unmistakable and completely integral sound of the Bollywood and Tollywood string section. And so this is an archival photograph of one of the early stringed sections performing for a film soundtrack. So, in drawing my discussion to a close this evening, I want to bring us forward slightly into the contemporary world and exchanges between Europe and India through short and long-necked lutes today. And I'm going to start with a digression via my favorite Hindi film, which is Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, or DDLJ, from 1995. And this film, of course, is a classic social film about the pull for families living in the diaspora, in this case in London, between Hindustani values and westernization. And in this film, as everyone knows, the male protagonist Raj, played by Shah Rukh Khan, represents the more westernized end of the spectrum. And like East India Company traders before him, on his backpacking tour around Europe, he carries a small, portable, short-necked plucked lute, which is specifically indexed as European in this film, and that's the mandolin. And it's also indexed as foreign I'll remember the name of the film later, but Baji Ramastani. So again, it's indexed as foreign. So the mandolin, of course, plays a critically important role in the film in representing Raj's love for Simran and her ability to recognize his love in the sound of the mandolin. And this is where working on Hindi film music is rather fun. So the songs and score are by famous duo Jatin Lalit, and they use a classic technique developed first by one of the greatest Western operatic composers, Richard Wagner. And they use it throughout the film to symbolize Raj's love. And this is the technique known as leitmotif. I'm going to sing the leitmotif for you in a minute. There are lots of parallels between European opera and Hindi film, not least the widespread aesthetic of melodrama. And indeed, an opera singer appears in an early scene in DDLJ when the friends get to Paris. In relation specifically to Wagner, one can also draw parallels between his concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, that an opera should be a total work of art, thoroughly integrating music with lyrics, with drama, with movement, with set design, with costumes, and so forth, and the original Sanskrit meaning of the term Sangeet, or Sangita, which is intended to encompass all three of music, dance, and drama, and including the lyrics. And it's meant to do so holistically. Wagner uses leitmotif to index particular characters and particular emotions in his operatic melodrama, and so do Jatin Lalit in DDLJ. So the Tujhe Dekha leitmotif is played on the mandolin by Raj without any words, multiple times before we actually get to the song. And the song, Tujhe Dekha, is the turning point of the whole film. So this is the leitmotif. तुझे देखा तो ये जाना सनम प्यार होता है दीवाना सनम तुझे देखा तो ये जाना सनम. And you hear that repeated over and over on the mandolin before you ever get any words. So it's first heard quite casually in the scene in the barn, where Simran has gone to escape the potential shame and ruin of having to sleep in the same room as a man, a relative stranger to her, to whom she is not married. And sitting in a horse cart, Raj plays it to himself, though in her earshot, just before she decides to drink cognac and lose some of her inhibitions and essentially fall for Raj, though this doesn't quite happen quite yet. And it's Raj's tune, and it symbolizes him, but it also comes to symbolize his love for her, and then him coming to rescue her. So we and Simran hear it several more times as Raj plays it at important points in their growing love story. And here's several of the important points. And then Simran begins to hallucinate the mandolin tune when she's apart from Raj when she returns to London. So walking through a park in the rain, she imagines Raj playing it to her in a horse cart, and this refers back to the first time she's heard it in the barn. And then when she goes to Punjab to marry her arranged and very unpleasant fiancé, she keeps hallucinating it, and she puts her hands over her ears to kind of stop the sound. But this is a harbinger that Raj is indeed following her to India. And we finally hear the full-blown version of the song, Tujhe Dekha, with its lyrics. When he finally arrives, she hears his mandolin early in the morning. And of course, there's all the wind as well, which is also part of the melodramatic icon. And she runs out into the mustard fields, into his arms. So it's an unbelievably clever use of a melodramatic technique and a melodic technique, originally of European operatic origin. And it's also an instrument originally of European origin. And it's this unbelievably clever use of this to do something so thoroughly and deeply Hindi filmy. I really love this film. I can't really end without just a quick mention of two long-necked lutes that separately are iconic of the West and India, the electric guitar and the sitar, but which have since the 1960s become thoroughly globalized. The long-necked lute is one of the oldest stringed instruments known to humans. It dates back at least 5,000 years to the ancient Middle East. It's so old and gone through so many iterations and appropriations as it's traveled, first through the old world and then through the new and now into the electric and internet age, that who is to say who owns it? To whom does it belong? The sitar and the electric guitar are cousins. One may be iconic of North Indian classical music, the other of North and particularly African American popular music. They're certainly very different in their levels of noise and volume, but if you can play one, you can learn to play the other. You can play rag on the electric guitar. You can play sitar in a rock band. The sitar and the electric guitar, in their differences, but also in their deep and fundamental structural similarities, represent what it is to be human, the best of what we could be, in our multifarious diversities of culture and belief and languages, musical and otherwise, but also in our shared humanness and our ability to connect deeply with one another over great distances of space and time. I always tell my students that scholarship is not a solo improvisation. It's a polyphony into which our own voice only enters partway through. And it's our job first to listen carefully to those other voices that have come before us before we join the polyphony with our own voices in harmony with those voices and sometimes in contrast. And the polyphony will continue after our own voice has left. The symphony orchestra, likewise, is a beautiful metaphor for a great diversity of voices, all moving and sounding differently, but in concert, in order to achieve something great and joyful together. Look at all those massed violins for their whole history, as South Asian as they are European. Look at all of us who love the sitar and the electric guitar and the oud and the banjo for that matter, and do not want to have to choose. Such music, literal and metaphorical, gives me hope for a better world. It has been an honor and privilege to deliver the Symphony Lecture this evening. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful lecture. And in the space of about 35 minutes, I think you encapsulated so many worlds, so much history, and so much of what really music is about, that it transcends boundaries, that it builds bridges. And you ended, of course, with that image of the orchestra where everything comes together in a wonderful confluence. So thank you very much. We're going to have a short discussion now, obviously, on your lecture. And I'd like you to delve a little more into your personal experience And you spoke about how you became first interested in Indian classical music. And I'd like you to speak a little more about that experience and what initially inspired you to start this journey. Was there some eureka moment that you'd like to speak about?
Thank you so much. So yes, it's a combination of things. So when I was about 19, I quit my degree because I got a job in an orchestra as a rank and file viola player, professional orchestra, which was the summit of my ambition. And in the year that I played with the orchestra, I realized that this was not actually where my heart lay. This was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And it was partly because in the symphony orchestra, and as beautiful as it is to be part of the sound, I really wanted to be, I think, the composer. I wanted to be the intellect behind whatever it was I was doing. And in the symphony orchestra, that person is the conductor and the composer and the soloist, but I was And two things happened. I started singing jazz with a friend of mine, and I also made friends with a group of people who'd all grown up in India. And I started listening to Indian music. But the thing that really hit home to me for the first time was a 1995 film called Dead Man Walking, which is about death row in America. It stars Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn as the criminal on death row. And it has an amazing soundtrack that's partly country music, but it also features the voice of the great Qawwal, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And I heard his voice, and he's incredibly well trained in rag and in tal and in all the aspects that also go with classical music, to which I was beginning to listen. And I was completely bowled over. I was like, what is that? Who is that? I have to follow that voice. And so when I moved to England the year after to marry my husband, I went to SOAS and discovered that you could study Hindustani classical music there, and that you could do it as a historian. And because I was become very, very interested in the history of how all of these things came together, but it was really in pursuit of that voice. And then I got hooked on Drupad, and then Khayal came a little later, and here we are, and that was nearly 30 years ago now.
Fascinating. You mentioned Muthuswami Dikshitar, and in fact, at tomorrow's concert of the South Asian Symphony Orchestra, where you will be present, we are going to perform a Notaswara set to orchestral music. So I just thought I'd mention that.
That's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. And I was listening to one of your podcasts about how in early British India, you had a lot of the Mem Sahibs who were fascinated with Hindustani music, especially the music of the courtesans and the dancing girls. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how Sophie Plowden wrote down the lyrics of these very painstakingly. She was a great note taker, and she set them to music, or at least gave them a musical form which could be comprehended more easily by the European taste. And in that context, you spoke about how you and a friend used the harpsichord to kind of transliterate some of the Hindustani music. And I was quite taken with that, because I have listened to the harpsichord in America, and there is a friend of mine who holds harpsichord concerts. And I wondered whether there would be any scope for some kind of coming together, not in fusion, but in mutual comprehension between our instruments, our stringed instruments, and the harpsichord.
I absolutely think that is the case. I don't know how many of you know the harpsichord, but the harpsichord is a beautiful instrument. It is a stringed instrument, so the notes are plucked, and it's a little bit like the qanun, which is the plucked dulcimer. So it sounds in some ways a little bit like a santur, and it can be made to sound like the tambura, like the drone. And so the harpsichordist I worked with on this material is a harpsichordist called Jane Chapman, who's at the Royal College of Music, and she's produced a CD of what are called Hindustani airs. So there's this little time period in the late 18th century where memsabs like Sophie Plowden or Sophia Plowden were going around India. They were collecting the songs sung by Tavaif, by Nach girls, and other Indian musicians, and they were transcribing, they were writing out the melodies as they heard them, and then setting a bass line to them and turning them into little European songs. And one of the things that we were trying to do was actually to try to work out whether from these transcriptions you could actually get back to what these songs may have sounded like at the time, because we also have the texts. And of course, the texts are largely Urdu and Persian ghazals, which have very set meters. So you can try to match the meters of the poetry to the time signatures of these songs. And some of it sounds very strange. But yes, so I really do think that is the case. But it's also what the Indian musicians of the time thought.
Right.
So.
And you had, one of my areas of exploration when it came to Western music was about songs of India, or how India and the Orient were depicted by Western musical composers. And the opera Lalla Rookh was based on this poem called Lalla Rookh by the Irish poet Thomas Moore, and was set to music and was like the Sound of Music of the 19th century, the Sound of Music meaning the film. It was so popular, but it's largely out of commission today. But it had beautiful songs about Kashmir and the journey of this mythical daughter of Aurangzeb, who never existed, from Delhi to Bukhara, because she was being married to the Prince of Bukhara. And there's beautiful music to accompany that. And why I'm saying this is, we all call it Orientalist views of the East. But do you think that there is some charm and there is some meaning about these kinds of interpretations?
I think so, and I think they can actually be reclaimed, because if you look at some of the beautiful, sort of the Persian stories of Layla and Majnun and Yusuf and Zulaikha, which were then turned into Parsi theatre, and if you look at some of the great kind of Indian of the Hindu love stories and epics as well, a lot of them have that similar kind of fantastical, magical sort of prince and princess, sort of charming story to them, which I think a lot of these Orientalist writers actually, they found them charming, which is why they wrote these things. It wasn't meant to depict real life in India, and I think they can be reclaimed.
Absolutely. I think it was a kind of lens through which to view India, and certainly fascinated a lot of Western visitors to India. I have this book which I picked up in some secondhand bookstore in the American Midwest, called An Emerald Set in a Garden of Pearls, which is about Kashmir. And it's about this English woman called Florence Parbury, who came to Kashmir in the early 20th century and wrote about some of Thomas More's poems, but also picked up Kashmiri lullabies and songs from Kashmir and set them to music. And they're, in some senses, very naive, but also charming from certain angles. So it's like the movie Shah Rukh Khan and the Kajol movie Dilwale that you spoke about.
DDLJ, and they use Switzerland instead of Kashmir.
Right. Yes. That's right. So that's really one aspect I thought I'd speak about. You spoke about, of course, the lute moving from Gandhara all the way across Europe, and then the violin coming back. And in Carnatic music, it's so much of a fixture, and there have been so many violin maestros in Carnatic music. And today I see that transition being made again by Gen Z, or whatever you call the latest generation. There is a musician in our orchestra, in the South Asian Symphony, who comes from a long lineage of Carnatic violinists. And she has taken now to the violin to play Western music, and now is at the Royal College of Music in London. And she's just auditioned for the Birmingham Symphony and been accepted. So you see this journey that you speak of, it comes around. And I think that is also one fascinating aspect of the story that you speak of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about the human body. We all have bodies, and they all, have similar capacities. Depending on our abilities, some of us have disabilities and so on. But and they can be turned to almost anything. And I think if you have the ears to listen and the heart to kind of accept difference and to take that into your own body and your own fingers, then anything is possible.
Yes, I think this aspect you speak about of being able to absorb. The other day we had a Japanese visitor to our home, and he brought along an instrument I'd never seen before. It was like a kind of an amalgamation of bamboo pipes. And it looked like something, when you think of music of the spheres, you think of something like that, an instrument like that. And he told me that it was called the sho in Japanese, and it really was meant to represent the phoenix rising literally from the dead. And he played it for us, and it sounded very much like the accordion or the bagpipes, which brings me also to the harmonium, which, we don't pay much attention to, but which is so much of a fixture in Indian classical music and in Indian popular music. And I believe it was very much a part of European music also.
Yes, absolutely. I love the harmonium. And I also love the accordion. But the harmonium, as everybody knows, it was a French invention about 1838, I think. Don't quote me, but it's the 1830s or early 40s. And as a portable organ, and people, think, oh, it came here, with the missionaries. Yes, missionaries did bring them, but everybody had portable organs because everybody wanted to kind of play their favorite keyboard pieces, or, if you couldn't access a symphony orchestra, but you wanted to hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, then you would do a piano arrangement, and maybe you would have that on your harmonium. And of course, it took off, hugely in India for all sorts of reasons. It didn't have the kind of stigma associated with the sarangi being associated with Nach girls, for example. But it could produce a consistent drone so that singers could sing against it. And it's now, it's definitely a South Asian instrument now. I mean, it is, I think it's iconic of here.
Absolutely. I'm sure that it's time perhaps that it goes back to the West.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah,
in fact, actually, a lovely, beautiful friend of mine passed away at the beginning of 2020, just before COVID. He had somebody sang at his funeral, and she sang a song from Purcell's opera, Dido and Aeneas, accompanying.
Which incidentally we performed on this very stage a few months ago.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. And it's the most beautiful opera. And she accompanied herself on a harmonium made in Kolkata while she sang this piece.
Oh, how wonderful. We should have perhaps incorporated that into the performance here. So when you look back on your long years of involvement with India and with Indian music, is there a sound, an instrument, or a musical moment from your research that comes back to you in a flashback when you think back?
That is just such a hard question to answer. I think actually I was preparing a lecture to undergraduate students on Qawwali at Sufi shrines, and listening to Maqabat of sung by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, which was recorded in the Albert Hall, and it's the most beautiful, calming thing. And I just remember thinking at the time, I can't believe that somebody pays me to listen to this in my office and then to teach undergraduate students about it. It's really quite unbelievable. So I feel just very privileged and lucky that the music of South Asia found me,
right,
not the other way around.
I'm going to just veer into geopolitics for a moment, because I know that you have been we're all witness to what has happened in Afghanistan with the return of the Taliban and what it has meant for music in that country. And I know you've been involved in bringing, or at least helping, Afghan musicians. You told this wonderful story. I heard you say that on one of your interviews about a musician in Kabul after it had fallen to the Taliban, and cognizant of the fact that they don't want any instruments to be seen around, and they even they kill people who are playing music or even listening to music. And this musician, who had antique musical instruments from the region, had to destroy those instruments sitting in his apartment, and then he didn't know where to carry the debris, because if he did carry it out, he would have been checked and that would have landed. So he was sitting there in his apartment surrounded by the ruins of the world that he had inhabited, which to me is so symbolic of many parts of the world today, because I often compare geopolitics today to the Fellini film, The Orchestra Rehearsal, where the orchestra rebels against the conductor, and every section is playing whatever they want. So on the one hand, you have governments who don't want music, and on the other hand, countries that are unable to get on with each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely terrible. So yes, so I when Kabul fell to the Taliban in August 2021, members of the Kabul University Music Department reached out to me and said, "Can you help?" And I thought, well, I mean, I probably have some contacts and I've probably got some clout. I've sort of worked on music in South Asia for a long time. And what kind of a person would I be if I said no? So I said yes. And then I was involved for quite a long period of time, quite intensely, with trying to help music professors and professional musicians get out of Afghanistan. And the person we're talking about was the head of department, Dr. Wahid Sughar, who's actually a Hindustani musician. He did his PhD here and then went back he's a singer, and went back to Afghanistan as the head of department. And I think his story is actually one of hope, because yes, he had to destroy his instruments. He just had to destroy his beautiful harmonium given to him by friends in India. And he was sitting there in the middle of the ruins of his harmonium, not knowing what to do, because if he burned them, then the Taliban would see the smoke, because he's in an apartment, but he couldn't take them out because there was a Taliban checkpoint on the door. And so in some ways it was sort of bleakly, sort of black humor, but also absolutely terrible. But he remembers going with Professor Islamuddin, who's still a member of the department. They're all now safe. They're all in exile in Germany. Professor Islamuddin, in 2001, the Taliban left and they reset up the music department about 2002. And Professor said, let's come with us. Let's all go to this place. And they went to this place and they got spades and picks and started digging. And they dug up the instruments that they had buried when the Taliban had come in 1996. And they were all still in good condition, in playable condition, because they'd kept them really carefully. And so they rescued the instruments and they reset up the department. And so history is repeating itself in a negative way at the moment, but the whole of the Kabul University Music Department did get out. They're all in the same place. And they have restarted a university music department in exile. And they all, of course, want to go back at some point, and maybe they will dig up the instruments that they had to bury again. But music doesn't stop. It's what John Bailey said of one particular Afghan musician said, "Can you stop the birds singing?"
Yeah.
And no, you can't.
So the music can never die. And as they say, music is a fundamental human right. I think it belongs to each and every one of us. We have had Afghan players in the symphony, or South Asian Symphony, although the return of the Taliban has changed things, because all those young boys and girls who played with us are now in exile in various parts of the world, mainly in Portugal and Germany, and some in the United States. So they haven't been able to come back as asylum seekers in those countries. They haven't been able to travel back to India to perform with us. But I always remember something that one of our violinists in the orchestra, Amanullah Noori, said for a film, a documentary that we made on our orchestra, saying that he wants to go back to Afghanistan and that he wants to replace the sound of war with the sound of music. And I think that is something that keeps hope alive.
Good evening. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. My name is Arati Rao. I'm with Jain University here in Bangalore. And when you were talking about the violin being in India much earlier than what it is supposed to have been, I was reminded of a couple of references that I have read in the writings of Professor R. Satyanarayana. He has said, I don't remember the exact article and all that, but I remember him writing that there is a painting in Mysore Palace which dates in a time period prior to Baluswami Dikshitar. Madhuswami Dikshitar's brother, who is supposed to have adapted the violin into Carnatic music, and that painting shows a violin player. So, and the other reference I remember is that in Tirumkudlu in Karnataka, there is apparently a sculpture. Again, I don't remember the exact time period and all that, but it's certainly prior to the Dikshitars. And apparently, the musician Mysoti Chaudhaya has said at some occasion that Tirumkudlu inscription, which shows a violin player, seems to show that the violin is much older here than what we previously thought. So I feel that perhaps, you might have heard of these references, and I'd like to know if you would have something to say about these.
In that context, since the lady has asked that question, the Tamil name for Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka is Yarl Panam, and Yarl is the Tamil harp.
Oh, wow.
So it goes back to the Sangam period, So history is still being unraveled, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I know about the one in Mysore Palace, but I'd be very interested in the sculptural one as well. Yeah, this is not surprising. And I think as with all history, you get these stories about what is history, and then you kind of discover pieces of evidence that actually don't quite fit with the historical narrative that you've learned. And while, of course, the Dikshita brothers were unbelievably important in bringing, the violin into the heart of Carnatic classical, we need to be looking for the earlier examples, which may be in paintings, they may be in sculptures, they may be in churches, they may be in temples. And I think once you start looking, you start finding them everywhere. I do know of a painting of a violinist earlier than that, from North India. Actually, it's a very strange painting, though. It seems to be of a European, so it might simply be a European playing it. But there is a painting from Tanjore from the early 19th century, which has a violinist in it. But again, that's the period of the Dikshita brothers, so similar. But I'm sure there's going to be lots of examples. So everybody keep looking.
Yeah. So echo the sentiments already expressed. Thank you for this most insightful lecture. I'm Satna Rao. I just want to draw your attention as the musical instruments started on their journey in the earlier years. Climatic conditions do have an effect on the instrument. What was it that the early artisans did? Any stories, any anecdotal details, any research on how did you combat, humidity and cold can affect the sharpness, the timbre. And segueing to that, any instrument that held its sway over centuries and then just suddenly disappeared? Yeah.
Wow,
Thank
they
you.
are two great questions. And actually, the one about climactic conditions is really important. So anybody who plays stringed instruments or drums will know that whether it's hot, wet, dry, or cold really affects the sound of the instrument. And, you have to kind of use various adjustments in the instrument to sort of keep it working properly in cold weather or wet weather. And there's all these stories from when the harpsichord was being brought to India of the monsoon rains just absolutely destroying the sound of the instruments, and the instruments having to be tuned every 5 minutes because they couldn't stay in tune because of the wet and so on. And of course, the climatic conditions do change. This is something that needs much more research. And I don't take my own research is not in the early period. So I'm really 17th, 18th, 19th century. And in this period, you have this you have the Ayurvedic theory of the humours, and you also have the Unani medicine idea of the humours. So there's 4 humours in one system and 3 in the other. But they're all to do with hot, dry, wet, and cold. And I think this is one of the reasons why the rags in northern India were kind of ascribed to particular seasons. So why is it that a particular rag can bring on the monsoon rains? Well, it's because it's got hot, wet swaras, right? So, and I think this is actually based on experience of how climate changes how musical instruments sound. But this needs a lot more work. But there are things like, so the place where most of the gourds for venas and sitars and tamburas are made today in India are really suffering from the changes in rain pattern. They can't grow big enough gourds, or they're having difficulty growing big enough gourds for musical instruments because of climate change. So these things are actually a vitally important question. Okay, as for instruments that were played ubiquitously and then disappeared, it's a very good question. And I mean, a lot of them get revived as well. So the harpsichord is actually an example of an instrument that nearly disappeared and then was revived in the sort of, by the 1930s. Nobody played the harpsichord anymore, but it gets revived. There are, so the original Veena of the Natya Shastra was not the Saraswati Veena or the Rudra Veena that we know today, which are organologically different. So the Rudra Veena is what's called a stick zither, and the Saraswati Veena is a lute, but with 2 resonators. It was a harp, and you can tell this from not just from the kinds of sculptures and so on that are around at the time, but actually from the descriptions in the Natya Shastra of the scale of the gramas and the murchanas and of the shrutis and where the shrutis are, that the instruments were actually a right-angled harp. And the right-angled harp was the iconic instrument used in the Natya Shastra to do music theory, and it's nowhere in India anymore. So I think that's probably a good example.
Strings have been the most exact measure.
Would you like
of
to
tonal.
identify yourself first, please?
Vinod Gaur. I was saying that strings have been the iconic measure of tonal fusion since the time of Pythagoras.
Yes.
And therefore, there's no surprise that virtually every culture should have devised some way of using strings as a device to please the mind. I was wondering as to what kind of effect has the tempered scale imposed on this much more natural tonal scale that the string provided? And how has it affected music in other parts of the world apart from Europe?
It's a very, very good question and an important one. Thank you. So for those of you who don't know, the acoustical scale, you can create all the 12 tones and semitones of what we call the Western scale, but all the 7 swaras and their 5 variants from placing strings into perfect fifths, acoustic fifths, over sort of 5 and then going up that way. And at the top, when you get from, C, you get all the way through, C, G, etc. You get all the way to the C at the top, and it's out of tune with the C at the bottom because it's slightly bigger than would be if everything were perfect mathematically. So various, from the time of Pythagoras, various theorists have come up with different solutions of how to tune things so that they sound right to the ear as far as possible, while actually still, sort of within one string, kind of bringing everything into, sort of playability. And equal temperament, where each semitone is the same size, was developed in the late 18th century in Europe as a kind of a compromise. But it does sound wrong, particularly if you've got a system where, like in Indian music, Indian classical music, where everything is actually relating to the tonic, to the drone, to the sa, and everything is bouncing off that. Equal temperament sounds wrong, and it also sounds wrong to any string player in a Western string quartet who's played a lot of string quartets, because you tune the strings across 5 sets of fifths, and quartet players don't actually play in equal temperament. They play in a kind of, getting the perfect intervals. I'm sorry, this is getting very, very nerdy. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, it's a brilliant question. I could talk about it for ages, but I think I'll probably stop.
Our conductor is here in the audience. He would probably understand it.
Yes, so I remember when I played in the chamber orchestra that I played with, the cellos and violas always tuned their bottom C string up a tiny bit so that it would be in tune with the violins when they were playing, C further up.
Hi, my name is Sri Lata and I teach musicology at the Bangalore University. I have a fairly easy question for you. But before that, I'm a big fan of your podcast, your writing and everything.
Thank you.
So the question is, it's about Carnatic music and Balaswami Dikshita. So what kind of music would he have learned? It just, when we read history, it says he learned the violin. Would he have learned Western? And, what is the process by which, at what time does a Western instrument? I assume they would have started with Western tunes.
Yeah.
What would have the lessons been like? Would you,
sure.
speculate about that?
So we do know that there were violin teachers, like Western violin teachers, usually Germans or Italians, who would come to the major cities. Certainly Kolkata, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and Chennai, Madras. And I think the answer is that we don't know exactly. We do know that he was mixing with military bands, and the military bands were trained by bandmasters in Western notation and Western styles, including Western melodies and so on. And a lot of those were marches and quadrilles and music for dancing. And so therefore, this is where the Irish and Scottish jigs and reels come from. And so the Notaswaram, a lot of those are from Irish and Scottish folk tunes. That's partly because the kinds of music that were being played by the military bands for entertainment purposes. So when the Europeans put on a ball, when they had enough women around to dance, they would have the local cantonment band as the musicians. And they were very often Indian musicians. And so my understanding is that Balaswami Dikshita learnt via the military band, but was probably the bandmaster or perhaps a violin teacher who was associated. But there's a rather fun, this is much further north, so there's a rather fun Urdu treatise from 1869, which has little pictures of Indians playing in military dress, playing the European band instruments with all their names of flute, bugle, drum, bass drum. And it's all the diacritical markings for the European words are in there. And it describes the dances that they learned and played. And it also describes the bowls, or what they would have understood as the tabla bowls, except they're not tabla bowls, they're, bass drum and side drum. And so there's one line which is urum tum tum, urum tum tum, urum tum tum, which is actually the marching syllables for, I think, quick march, which is in there. So there's very definitely a kind of a training element there from European bandmasters coming in and training. And that's the most likely, I would say. But also, he had fantastic ears. He probably picked up a lot of it just orally. So,
Talking about military bands, is there an archive of military band music in the UK which, talks about the linkages with India?
that is a very good question, and one to which I do not know the answer. There almost certainly is, because I know a lot of the regiments that were East India Company regiments, and then Indian regiments also have their counterparts in the UK still. And one of the things I do want to do is to do some work in the National Army Museum in London, because they have all of James Skinner, the famous Skinner's horse from Delhi. They have all of his military memoirs and his Persian. They're all in Persian, instructions and on how to kind of run a mercenary army. And they have instruments from the Indian regiments, still there, from the late 18th, early 19th century. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dhananjay, and I've learned to play Carnatic violin in one of the prominent schools of Carnatic violin, which is the Parur School of MS Gopalakrishnan. And my question to you is, for vocal traditions in India, we have a very good sense of genealogy, who learned from which guru and so on. But in the violin schools, so you take the Parur school, you take the Dwaram school in Vijayanagaram, you take Lalgudi, you take Chaudhaya school, do we have a good sense of the genealogy and how these schools originated? Because they're all quite musically distinct from each other. That's one.
Yeah.
And secondly, today violin has become more and more, people like violin because it imitates the voice, the gayaki style, etc. But how was it 200 years ago? Was it much more of a solo instrument than it is today?
They're great questions, and I have to preface this with saying that I'm not although I'm a great enthusiast for and lover of Carnatic music, my main focus is on Hindustani. But even in Hindustani music, where the gharanas are much more kind of delineated, they really only talk about one, the sort of senior gharana for instruments. And my suspicion would be that it would be similar for violin. But I think that's work that needs to be done by Carnatic violinists. And it's something that could be done. And it's something that has always interested me as a Western classical violinist and viola player, is that I knew who my teacher was and who his teacher was, and then who his teacher was. And so that therefore there must be something still from Carl Flesch, who wrote a series of etudes and exercises for the violin, in my playing, going back 4 generations of teachers. But nobody's really done that kind of work for Western violin. And your second question was, remind me? Yes. So very, very much, I would say, less solo in the past than it is now. Much more about accompanying than about solo. So the solo is really very much a 20th, 21st century phenomenon.
The last question of the evening. Good evening. I'm Nilima, and thank you so much for sharing, both of you, and for this opportunity to just listen to you. My question actually combines both your areas of expertise, and something that really struck a chord is about music as a bridge and music as a self, and what we can learn from history. So maybe if the example of this Taliban professor, sorry, the the Afghan professor in the Taliban times really struck a chord. And maybe what we can learn from history about music being a bridge and salve for people in conflict. So my thoughts go to Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, Russia, and maybe there are examples of what you've seen about how we can help in rebuilding efforts or peace.
Do you want to answer that question first?
About how music can
in conflict zones and-
yeah. Well, it's very difficult, of course. Music has also, not just as we normally conceive of it, not just with the sound of peace, but it has also accompanied the sound of war. And especially if you think of the Napoleonic Wars, at least in written history, and I'm sure much before that, music did accompany armies. That's how military bands, I suppose, found their genesis. Your question was how does music survive, you mean, in these situations, or does it mutate? Or I mean, I didn't exactly understand.
So just the very specific instance of this Afghan professor, the story.
Yes.
And I'm curious about if there are any other stories as such who have found music in adversity, which we can perhaps then share with these worlds which are in conflict yet, and they can
I
find.
think worlds in conflict. I mean, I think of our own situation in our own region, where South Asia is the least integrated of regions anywhere in the world, although it's meant to be an integer. And when I say that, it's meant to be a civilizational integer, and music applies very much in that context, right? And so when you think of the music of India and Pakistan, and when somebody like Farida Khanum says that to experience music in your soul and your heart, you have to feel dard, meaning pain. And I think that, in a sense, answers what you're saying. And that is the pain we all feel because of the lack of integration and because politics becomes an everyday issue. And we can't really we can't fight it, we can't resist it. It envelops us. Where music, it's taken the place of music in many ways.
Yeah. And I think also one thing that music and a lot of the arts can do is it creates a kind of time out of time as a space for reflection where, particularly with music, music is acting directly on the emotions, even when there's no words involved. And so it provides a space where you can actually contemplate these things, but also where you're doing it usually, if it's live performance, in company with other people with whom you're experiencing things, and you're different from those people, you're different from the other members of the audience, you're different from the people on stage, and so on, but you're all experiencing these emotions together, and that can act as a kind of a space for reflection, a space where that creates possibilities for different kinds of change. And I mean, I know we both have colleagues who use the arts as ways of bringing people together. So I'm just thinking about my lovely colleague, Darren Ferguson, who's the CEO of an organization called Beyond Skin, who are a peace building charity in Northern Ireland, who work originally between the warring Protestant and Catholic communities just after the Good Friday Agreement, to get them together through their shared love of music and the arts. And music is something that actually brings both sides of that divide together, and that they both love and both enjoy. And it's something that people can do together. And then it creates a space for dialogue. Yeah, I think that's probably the example I'd like to finish with.
Thank you so much.